And then when we get to discussion, I'll take that back off because so nobody's privacy is um, compromised. So, so today I'm using my computer, which I don't ordinarily do. So every so often there might be something. But when I when I went to print it, it printed over each other. Couldn't read it. So here we are. I got one.
Okay.
So the title of the talk today was Practicing in Community. And I had I had about 3/4 of the talk figured out, and then I went, oh, it's Mother's Day. Ah. So my mother's been gone for a long time, and I just didn't even think of it. So for the last 4 or 5 days, I've been working on this. It usually takes me a while to get my thoughts together about how I want to focus the talk. And so I am leaving practicing in community, but we're going to talk about the mothers of Buddhism. And since I'm a mother and it's Mother's Day, I get to talk about whatever I want to. And so that really seems really important to our earth. It's really important. The word feminist, I am a feminist. The word feminist has gotten sort of a bad shrift lately, off and on, depending on who you talk with. But it is still needed in our society. I would like it if it wasn't needed, if we didn't have to have that designation of a feminist. But and that these feminist issues are not a special interest. It's not just like, oh, well, Charlie's going to talk about that, so all the women should come this time. No, I want everybody to be here. And I'm going to I'm going to introduce you, if you don't already know, to some of the really wonderful mothers of Buddhism in the current time who are talking about the ones in the past. Hang on a second here. So, Rita Gross is one of the really wonderful writers about feminist philosophy and Buddhism and how they intersect. She was trained as in the Tibetan tradition, and so that's her background. That's where she comes from. But she's written probably the best books about this whole topic. So if we're looking, well, I would just read you one part from one of her books. Usually those who analyze the causes of social conditions that cause suffering, and suffering is what we're talking about. We're talking about noticing it and alleviating it. Conditions that cause suffering, such as disease, famine, war, poverty, and environmental degradation, then seek to alleviate those situations, are generally appreciated, not vilified and marginalized. And she goes on to ask, why would those who seek to alleviate the prison of gender roles and the suffering and ignorance caused by that prison be regarded differently? And so I'm not talking about men are bad and women are good. I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking about is the roles that we're set in. And so I was raised in the 50s. There's some of you that don't know who June Cleaver was, but there was a program on television where a lady, when her husband came home from work, had pearls on and heels, and that's the way she did all of her housework and everything. And so, amongst some of us, June Cleaver is sort of a an easy way to talk about that gender role, which in a lot of cases we've moved away from. Very few women wear pearls at home, but there is still that gender designation a lot of times, and it's hard to come out of. So I was raised in that. I was raised in if I wanted something from people that were in power, who were usually men, then I had to be coy. I had to flirt. I had to do all of those things in order to get the things that I want. And um, so there's um, a lot of things to be thought about because our um, the Buddhist stories and everything are male centered. And just recently, with Rita Gross in the late 90s, she died in 2015. Um, and with Wendy Garling and Susan Murcott doing research about, there really is a lot of information about women in Buddhism, but those stories are not the common ones that are told. And and so this is referred to in studies as androcentrism, which is the worldview that's still up until this time that's relatively male-centered. If you say the human race, then most people think of men in that context. Males are defined as the norm. We do women's stuff, but that's considered different. You know, we have a women's circle, and that's separate. We did that intentionally not because the guys are bad, not ever, ever, but because it's different when we're by ourselves. And so that androcentrism is permeating everything. And my purpose today is to just remind us that it's permeating everything, and that maybe we should look at this from a different perspective, and maybe just be more conscious and more aware. And and that's what my practice is to be more mindful about everything. And so that's one of the things. So all of the texts were edited by androcentric people. That very few of the texts were edited, and like most of the things that were written down about the Buddha, who supposedly said things, were written down about 500 years after he lived. So I'm not saying they're not true, but I'm just saying that the through stories were all edited by people who were looking at it from an androcentric perspective. And so another quote from Rita Gross, patriarchy. So you'll hear that referred to too, and people are like, down with the patriarchy and all of that. So in my perspective, if we're fighting against something, that is not the way to make that anything work, because fighting is not what we want to be doing. We want to be including everybody as much as possible. But we do have to really name the things that are happening right now. So patriarchy has become the feminist shorthand for the anti-vision that has fueled much of society and religion for the past several thousand years, and led to the mindset in which the androcentric model of humanity not only found acceptance, but reigned without conceptual alternatives. And so people just thought that was the norm. So just recently, and I know that it drives some people crazy, but just recently people have started like changing the pronouns and things from him and he, and our language considered that appropriate to include everyone, but it didn't really include everyone. And so what I'm asking you to do is to look at those circumstances when our practice is perpetuating that. So patriarchy is not misogyny. It doesn't mean men hate women or anything like that. It's just that the culture has been created with that predominant. And the goal is to have freedom from gender roles. And some people are, some families are doing a good job of that. but still it often is that guys are helping out the women rather than it being a communal thing, like both of us have this responsibility. And and again, for me, it's been very difficult for me to change the paradigm in which I work because it was the water that I lived in. So when I talked to my dad, my parents have been gone since 2012, both of them died that year. But when I was talking to my dad maybe 10 or 15 years before that, and I said, well, I really only thought there were two things. I could be a nurse or I could be a teacher. And he goes, we never told you that. And I said, no, you didn't tell me that. But there were no examples in my little bitty town of any women who did anything except if they helped their husbands on the farm. So, so it's so ubiquitous and so ingrained in us that we don't even recognize that it's there. And so that's what I'm asking, to pay attention to that. We're not erasing the differences. I mean, I look different than a guy, and guys look different than me. There's an intrinsic. I could have a baby and grow them in my body. That's different. But what we're talking about are the roles that are assigned, and not necessarily the body that is different. So the goal is to have that freedom from gender roles, not erasing women and men as different sexes. If the patriarchy in the way that it's used in our country and well all over the world now denotes that men deserve that it is automatic to have power. So when a man walks into the room, frequently people defer to him, and it's not his fault. I'm not blaming. I want you very clear about that, that I'm not blaming anyone. I'm just saying that that's how we have been enculturated, and I'm asking you to be mindful of that. To like just, oh, the tenor in the room changed. What was that about? You know, the feeling in the room changed. What was that about? So, um, so I'm going to. So when that there are two ways that women are described in Buddhism. One is that there's some basic problem with the female gender, and oh, we didn't bring that one. So there's a story from Vimalakirti, which is sort of an obscure text if you're not into Zen, and but there's a story about a goddess who is in this room talking to Shariputra. So you all know who Shariputra is. He was one of the Buddha's main guys. And she, there were a whole bunch of bodhisattvas in the room, and then there were the guys that were close to the Buddha. And she caused flowers to fall down, and they just like went right down to the floor on the bodhisattvas, but on the guys that were close to the Buddha, it stuck to them, and they couldn't get rid of the flowers. And her point, and she said, well, because you have the concept that that's bad for you to have like decorations on your robes, then that is something that you're clinging to, you're staying to, and so the flowers would not go off. They couldn't pick them off or anything because because their concepts of what the world, the right way things should be and the wrong way things should be was something that they were clinging to. The bodhisattvas allowed whatever happened, happened. So they went on to have more of a discussion, and Shariputra says, well, she was female, the goddess was. He says, well, how come if you have so much power, how come you're female? Because, you know, only men can be the Buddha. And she goes, well, there's no difference. The way that people can become enlightened. There's no male or female. There is male in the reality in this world that we hold here, but in the bigger picture, there's no male or female. And so what she did was she changed Shariputra into a woman and herself into him, changed them. And I don't know, these are myths. The myths are really fun because they talk about what the feelings are and the emotions and things that are going on in that culture. And he's like, wait, oh no. And she goes, well, change yourself back. He said, well, I can't. And she talked about the idea um, that there wasn't any way for him to find what it was that was female or male in him when he went into looking at it from that wider perspective, that he couldn't identify what it was that he needed to change. And so that's one story. So in some ways, it's told in Buddhism that there's something intrinsically wrong with women, and that if you want to actually be enlightened, you have to go through another life and become a man. And she's saying, maybe not, maybe not. And so what I'm trying to do today is to give you some other stories, because the predominant stories are the androcentric stories. And what we want are ones that are more androgynous, that don't have those roles in it. So the historical record of Buddhism is really hard to figure out, because there's just not very much history about the women, the early women, and there's just recently are starting to be. The Therigatha is one example. There's a set of 73 poems that were written by women who were students of the Buddha at the time of the Buddha. So we don't know if that's true, because we know these stories. We don't know any of the stories are true, because they were all written down 500 years after they occurred. But these are the ones that were preserved, and it's sort of interesting that there were designated 73 poems by women. So my guess is that there probably were women, because it would have been unusual for that to have happened otherwise. So, and so when this historical record is made to be inclusive, to include all of the people that were there and not just the guys, this really matters, because it ends up that you look at the world in a different way, an entirely different way. And what we're talking about when we're awakening is that when you awaken, it means that you see things in an entirely different way. And so one level of awakening is seeing that those gender roles are imposed and not intrinsic. And so one level of awakening is that possibility. So it really matters that there are more female stories, because they are the family stories. They're the ones that tell us how people did things that were there right with the Buddha. And so even the fables and stories that matter because of that. So the first mothers of Buddhism, the very first mother, is a goddess called Prithvi. And I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, but that's as close as I can get. So she was, at the time, the earth goddess. And there are a lot of stories about the goddesses in the Buddha's early life. It was part of the culture at the time. And the way this story goes is that Buddha was sitting underneath the Bodhi tree, and becoming enlightened. And Mara, the devil, representation, came to him and tried to do all kinds of things. And he said, well, what makes you think you should be enlightened? What possibility is there that you have the right to be enlightened? And this is one of there's a symbol in Buddhism where the Buddha is sitting and his right hand reaches down to the earth. Well, the earth in some of the stories is called Prithvi, Prithvi, and it is the goddess that was of the earth, or Gaia, we call her now. And and the way that he responded to Mara was he touched the earth and she rose up. Actually, she had given him that spot in order to set a special spot. But she rose up and said, I gave him that right. I gave him that right. She never forgets anything that happens on the earth. She rejoices in anything that enhances the well-being of life upon her surface. And when Mara challenged Siddhartha to provide, Siddhartha, that was Buddha's name before he became Buddha, when Amara challenged Siddhartha to provide a witness to his worthiness to attain enlightenment, the Bodhisattva stretched forth his golden hand, that's the way they described him, and touched the earth, invoking the one who observes and remembers every event that transpires on her vast body. And the picture of I have a picture at home of the goddess coming up like this and holding the seat that he was sitting on, rising up out of the earth. So and we know that that a lot of the wisdom teachings are feminine in their structure and also in the acknowledgement that that's where they come. They come from the womb. They come from the deepness. And so she was the first mother of Buddhism. The next one that we hear all the time is Mahapajapati, and she was his foster mother. You know the story that his mother was Maya, and 7 days after he was born, she died. And that her sister was married to the king also, and so she took the baby and evidently had a baby recently, and so she was able to nurse the Buddha. We know that she had 2 other children at least. So so Mahapajapati is the mother that took the Buddha, and she also is, so she was the one that he called mother. And she also, there are stories about her. If you start pulling things apart, there are lots of stories about her relationship with him. And one of the really beautiful ones is, I'm going to read to you. I forget. So, thus I have heard on one occasion, the Blessed One was living in the Sakyan country at Kapilavatthu in Nigroda's Park. Then Mahapajapati Gautami took a new pair of cloths and went to the Blessed One. After paying homage to him, she sat down at one side and said to the Blessed One, Venerable Sir, this new pair of cloths has been spun by me. So they used uncut cloths for their robes. This cloth had been spun by me, woven by me, especially for the Blessed One. Venerable Sir, let the Blessed One accept it from me out of compassion. When this was said, the Blessed One told her, Give it to the Sangha, Gautami. When you give it to the Sangha, the offering will be made both to me and to the Sangha. A second time and a third time she said to the Blessed One, Venerable Sir, accept it from me out of compassion. A second time and a third time the Blessed One told her, Give it to the Sangha, Gautami. When you give it to the Sangha, the offering will be made both to me and to the Sangha. And Wendy Garland's commentary on it is that he felt that there would be more blessings given to her if she gave it to the Sangha rather than just giving it to him. But her relationship with him continued. And then when there had been a war and a lot of the men in the country had been killed, and the ones that hadn't been killed, a lot of them had gone with the Buddha, there were a whole bunch of women that didn't have anyone to help take care of them in that culture. And so they came to to Mahapajapati, who was not Maha then, she was just uh, Japa, um, Mahapajapati. I always have trouble with that because I learned it a different way. and and she became the voice for them, and they went to the Buddha and asked to be taught. The stories say that there were 500 women. 500 was a place holder to say whole lot, so we don't know for sure how many. But she went to first the Buddha to ask to be taught, and they did allow that on opposite days, because in that culture the men and the women were separate. So the men went one day, the women went the next, and like that while he was visiting them. And then later, she and those 500 women came to the Buddha and asked to be ordained, to be allowed to become bodhisattvas and to be ordained. And she asked for three different times, and Ananda, who was another one of the Buddha's main guys, he was his direct caregiver, uh, basically. He finally um, got the Buddha to change his mind, which is a really interesting thing, because the Buddha just sort of, you know, told people how it was, but in this instance, he actually changed his mind and allowed those 500 women. And there are multiple stories about women and men being taught by some of the main people, particularly Mahapajapati, and so they are referred to um, in the Therigatha, which is the collection of poems that were actually written down and are in the Pali texts. The Pali texts are the most conservative of the texts, and so it's really significant that this is in the Pali text. So this was Pajapati's poem. Homage to Buddha, best of all creatures, who set me and many others free from pain. All pain is understood, the cause, the craving is dried up, the noble eightfold way unfolds. I have reached a state where everything stops. I have been mother, son, father, brother, grandmother, knowing nothing of the truth. I journeyed on, but I have seen the Blessed One. This is my last body, and I will not go from birth to birth again. Look at the disciples altogether, their energy, their sincere effort. This is homage to the Buddhas. Maya, her sister, gave birth to Gautama, which was the Buddha's name before he was Buddha. Maya gave birth to Gautama for the sake of us all. She has driven back the pain of the sick and the dying. And so it's reported that she had many students, and if you go through the poetry, you'll find Therigatha poems from many of those students. Patakara was one of them in particular that was also a wonderful teacher, and so probably had the most students other than Pajapati. And so Patakara's poem goes like this. So when they plow their fields and sow seeds in the earth, when they care for their wives and children, young Brahmins find riches. But I've done everything right and followed the rule of my teacher. I'm not lazy or proud. Why haven't I found peace? Bathing my feet, I watched the bathwater spill down the slope. I concentrated my mind the way you train a good horse. Then I took a lamp and went into my cell, my room, and checked the bed and sat down on it. I took a needle and pushed the wick down. When the lamp went out, my mind was free. So that was her story of like suddenly being enlightened. And she was a wonderful teacher, and so there are a number of the other poems that are written by her students also. So, so the purpose of me bringing this to you is again for you to hear these mothers of Buddhism, um, Maha Prajapati, Padakara, Prithi, who was the goddess that gave the Buddha the permission to become enlightened. And there are many others, the curiosity to discover who they were and to put them into the stories that we hear regularly, I think is really important. And so when you look through this lens of like recognizing that the roles that we are given are not the bigger picture, then everything looks different. Everything looks different. And so, is that awakening? So, I'll stop there.